My name is Joy Mayer, and I am part of the Election SOS team and helping with this fellowships program. I'm so excited we were able to get it off the ground, and I'm excited for the experience you guys are going to have, and excited that the newsrooms you're going to work with are going to benefit from your enthusiasm and passion and skills, and some really important jobs to do that I'm excited to talk to you about today. So I know that those of you who working on online monitoring roles have come at this from a few different perspectives this week, and there's more to come today. And I will be on the one that's in an hour as well with Nisha from Vox, who's going to teach you some really basic, super useful like search tools across different platforms. I hope these trainings complement each other well. What I'm excited to talk to you about today is what newsrooms should know about audience perceptions of their work. And so let's dive right into that. I'm going to keep this pretty informal. I do have a slide deck to talk through some key concepts and show you some examples, but feel free to unmute yourself and interrupt anytime or to put questions in the chat, and Matthew will help me keep an eye on that. All right, so I run a project called Trusting News, which is based at the Reynolds Journalism Institute at the University of Missouri, where I taught for 12 years, and also at the American Press Institute in DC. And we try to figure out what people think of journalism and what journalists can do to rebuild trust through like transparency and engagement strategies. So we spend our time training newsrooms on how to build trust basically, and figure out what gets in the way of trust and what can we as newsrooms do about that. Some newsrooms are totally ripe for that conversation and excited about it, and others are like, what are you talking about? People should just trust us, end of story. There's nothing we can do about it. So you won't know yet what your current newsroom's your assigned newsroom's attitude is toward audience feedback. And so I want to walk you through some ways to think about that and hopefully leave you with some good questions to go in with and some strategies in place. So we're going to talk about why it's important that newsrooms, this sounds super basic, but that newsrooms should pay attention to and care about what people think about their work, where you can be watching for online conversations about journalism, what you're listening for and how that's useful, what you can do with what you hear in those online conversations, and then what your newsroom can do in response to that. So why should newsrooms care? You ready? We're going to start with the basics. Journalists should have empathy for the experience of consuming news. It is super frustrating. You might know from conversations you have in your own life that people are really overwhelmed by news, that not all news is credible or responsible or easy to follow. A lot of it's sort of crisis oriented. Some of it is sensational. Some of it's unethical. Like there are all these problems that happen in the larger journalism landscape. And it's really important for us to recognize that that's what it's like to consume our product and that we are indeed part of this greater media landscape. So appreciating the experience of consuming the news and some of those like basic perceptions is really important. A second reason that it's a second opportunity we find when we look at audience feedback is that we can respond publicly to questions and concerns. So if people say, you're only doing this because of this, or why didn't you ask this question, or why haven't you told this story? That's an amazing opportunity to correct the record or tell your own story publicly. There's an opportunity to be more thoughtful and clear about what we're doing when we see what people don't understand. So if people say you only have a paywall because it's making you rich, then you have a chance to say, actually, we're not rich. We're losing a bunch of money. We do rely on community support. So understanding what people think about your work is key to being able to better explain it. People also don't pay for news that they don't trust. And understanding what people think of your work is a good first step in getting more people to give you their dollars or give you their attention or whatever the metric is that allows you to charge for advertising or get donations or memberships or subscriptions. So it's really important to remember that we don't get automatic credit for our good intentions. As journalists, it's really tempting to say, well, I know that I'm being responsible. I'm working really hard on behalf of this community. My only goal is to serve democracy and give people the information they need. There are all these things about how we do our work that seem really obvious to us, but nobody else sees them. And so understanding the perceptions of our work, as frustrating as it is to dive into comments and sort of absorb negativity that's being launched at journalists, it's key to getting credit for those good intentions. Way too many people don't think of journalism as a public service. And when asked whether journalism is good for democracy, American adults are actually pretty split on whether it's bad for democracy, neutral, or good, which is like sad to think about, right? And yet I consume journalism sometimes and think this is not good for democracy. So it's true. It's true that it's a very mixed bag. So we need to tell a better story about our work, and we need to do that on two levels. Some of the things people want to know about journalism are brand level, like, why are you here? How long have you been around? Who owns you? Where do you get your money? What are your ethics policies? How do you handle accuracy and corrections and conflict of interest? Those like big picture things, right? That like the boss kind of has to figure out. But if people don't know it, if people have a basic misassumption about your ownership or your ethics, like that's something the newsroom should care about. And then there's the day-to-day level of like, what do people assume about why you run stories about political polls and the perception that those are always wrong, or the credibility of a specific reporter behind the work, or like an ethical decision that's made as part of a story. So it's important to think through like, what can reporters do? What can we do in stories? What can we do in comments? And then what does the brand sort of need to address? So what we recommend to journalists is that they start by understanding the mistrust. What do people really think of your work? What makes them mad and frustrated? What do they appreciate? Remembering, of course, that skepticism is valid. Journalists are skeptical creatures, and we're skeptical of what anybody tells us. We definitely would not ever recommend that people should just sort of blindly believe everything they see on the internet, right? And yet somehow we sort of expect blind trust in what we do. We expect that our brand sort of protects us from skepticism. And in fact, I think we should reward skepticism, validate it, and then back up our statement that we're trustworthy with actual data. And then we can address the misassumptions. So if people think that we pay sources, that we don't care about accuracy, that we're driven by a political agenda, or that we like to make people look bad, that sort of idea of gotcha journalism, like whatever people think about us, nobody but us is going to correct the record. So we can wish that people didn't have that perception, or we can do something about it. And once we decide to do something about it, what is the story we'd like to tell about ourselves, about the range of things we cover, about why we're not part of the fake news, that sort of thing. So when you head into newsrooms, you, as I said, might be heading into a newsroom where they have a robust engagement strategy, where they actively participate in comments already, where they value audience feedback and have systems in place to respond to it, where their boss is super public facing and engages a lot and maybe writes a weekly column about how the newsroom operates. This might be normal for them. You might also head to a newsroom where they have given up on the comments. I was just had in a class last month, someone at a major metro newspaper who said they basically just ignored the comments. They didn't feel like they had time for them. They didn't pay any attention. They certainly didn't respond to them. So you don't know what kind of situation you're heading into. So one of your first tasks is going to be to figure out how you fit into this. Do people respond and engage to user feedback? Who's tasked with that? Is there a team? Is there like a reporter or two maybe who tend to do it and sort of explain things? You'll have to figure out how that works. And some newsrooms, the answer might just be that it's not, and that you're sort of starting from scratch. The good news, of course, is that they chose to have someone assigned to this in their newsroom. They want you there. So even if they're not doing it, they see the benefit in doing it. So what we often do when we start with newsrooms is say, like, how do you hear from your audiences? Which feedback loops are helpful and which are toxic? Do you get phone calls? Do you get emails? How do reporters handle it when they bump into sources and they have feedback? What does your feedback system look like? Are you learning from feedback or ignoring it? If you're learning from it, what are you doing with what you're learning? Are you adjusting your processes at all? So I'm going to give you throughout the presentation on these gold slides some questions you should jot down. I'll give them to you all at once at the end. Questions you're going to want to find out from your newsroom as you're starting. So the first question is like, how do you monitor online feedback already? So that you know how you fit in and whether you're starting from scratch. How are we doing so far? You guys with me? Okay. And then how can I usefully share what I learn? We're going to talk about systems for once you are gathering feedback, how do you share that back with the newsroom? What is sort of the format that they would like for that? So let's talk about where we can listen to online conversation about our journalism. Website comments are a quick one. I'm going to tell you about things that are publicly available because I don't know if your newsroom will want you to have access to like be an admin or an editor on a Facebook page that would allow you to look at private messages, to monitor an inbox to the newsroom. I don't know if you'll be on like a newsroom Slack where you'll have access to other conversations they're already having about what they're hearing from their audience. So I'm going to focus on things that are public. Website comments are a great one. Facebook comments on their brand pages. So if your TV station posts a story that they just aired, the comments that come under that post. Also really ripe for feedback are Facebook groups that are hosted by your brand. So if you go somewhere where they have a Facebook group hosted by a station or a newsroom dedicated to politics or crime or a specific topic, or schools, education, then that's a good spot to join the group and moderate. If I were you, I would start by making sure you're following your newsroom on all social platforms, and also click and see if they have Facebook groups that they host. Anywhere else on the internet that people share your stories is also a really good spot to pay attention, especially with really high profile stories or controversial stories. So we'll talk in the next session about some good ways to search, and the CrowdTangle plugin that was mentioned at yesterday's training is a great one because it'll let you see, oh, somebody high profile shared this, or this got a lot of traction. And then you can look there and see, as people talk about that story, are they talking not just about the content of the story, but also about the journalism? I bet they just did this story because of this, or they didn't even talk to this person. You're looking for reactions. And then also just, paying attention to what people say in the newsroom. Is there a Slack channel? Do you overhear reporters talking about what they're hearing from sources out in the community, or that sort of thing? So another question to ask your newsrooms is, where do you see conversations about your work? So that they can say, oh, there's this group dedicated to civic life that is always really robust, and they love us there, they hate us there, they have plenty to say about us there. So let's talk next about what you are listening for as you are searching, and why we should care about each type of feedback. So when we are teaching a class or working with a newsroom, we often start by giving the journalists in our classes the assignment to do an analysis of their own feedback loop. So go out and study exactly the things that I'm telling you to study, plus like emails and phone calls and stuff, and say, what are you mostly hearing from the public? And these are the types of things that we hear from them. People have at times said that journalists are hyping stories or not providing a fair report. The reports are fake news. A lot of complaints about like negative journalism and how journalists only pay attention to what's negative. Sensationalism. Complaints about a poor website or user experience, like it's always logging me out or kicking me off, or some of it's customer service stuff, like the paper never arrives on time, and like the newsroom should know about that and care about it. A lack of trust in our ability to provide an unbiased and fair information. People assume we're looking to promote a certain agenda. We hear a lot about diversity issues that the community really notices when the masthead is all white, or where diversity statements made by a newsroom are sort of aspirational but don't really represent anything they could be held accountable for, or don't seem to be reflected in the day-to-day decisions on the newsrooms. And also perceptions, on the flip side of that, perceptions that coverage of marginalized communities equate to political correctness. We hear from editors that they're hearing from their community, they might hear from people who live in an all-white, wealthy suburban area that they think the coverage of, racial justice protests downtown or LGBTQ issues are skewed, are like out of proportion, and that editors have an opportunity then to do some education around like, well, this is a very diverse community. Let's look at the census data. There are a lot of people who live here who don't live in a world that looks like your world, and we aim to serve all of them. So like just understanding what people think about the choices you're making about what to cover is important. Customer service complaints, shrinking staffs, communities notice when there are just fewer journalists or fewer stories. There's a perception that we'll do anything to get a story, even if it hurts somebody, that we don't reflect the diversity of our community. A lot of confusion about news and opinion coverage. So this was a journalist who said, we continue to experience a pattern of misinterpretation that columnist positions are positions in the newsroom. And definitely, like, stories travel to social media, and there might be a label on the website that says it's opinion content, but when the link is posted onto Facebook, there's nothing that says it's opinion. And then people feel like opinions are creeping into news coverage, when in fact it's a problem of like lazy labeling. So a lot of confusion around like what's opinion and what's news, and the separation between the two. Here are some assumptions related to COVID. We're manipulating information to be more dramatic. When a lot of newsrooms dropped their paywalls for COVID coverage for a while, and when those started to come back, people, readers got mad about that. Local stories tended to evolve into like national. I was just this morning in a conversation hosted by my local newspaper where I used to work, that's related to K-12 schools, and like something about the mask mandate turned into like Dr. Fauci and his relationship with the Gates Foundation and how rich he's getting off of a potential vaccine, and like a local thing about the school board's decision about mask mandates turns into that. And that can be really frustrating to moderate for journalists. And also it's an opportunity for journalists to remind people what their scope is and what they're here to do. So a key question. So actually, let me stop for a second and say, what else do you guys hear in your student media, from your family and friends, from any other newsrooms you've worked at? Like what was not on that list that you hear a lot about journalism, sort of misconceptions about journalism? Feel free to unmute yourself.
Over the summer, I had this problem where like my family members who didn't know that I like do journalism would like post on Facebook and be like, "Oh, the media is getting everything wrong with the protests." And I was just like, I am the media, in fact. I don't know, like I think a lot of people like don't realize that it's not like the media is not a big institution. It's like different individuals. Also, like over the summer, there would be videos and it'd be like, oh, like the media is not filming this. The media would never film it. And it would be like a local reporter who took the footage, like that kind of thing. Like people have misconceptions about what the media actually is.
It might be my least favorite 2-word phrase in the English language. I just want to always put it in quotes, right? The media. Right. I'm totally with you. Yeah, I remind people a lot that this is me you're talking about here, and you know me. And like, do you actually think that there are people like me in newsrooms who have this agenda and are like sneakily sneaking it into their coverage? Yeah, absolutely.
I tend to think that happens a lot more in like broadcast news with big corporations that own a lot of different newsrooms, like Sinclair. You know, you can find videos where like a bunch of different news organizations are saying word for word the same thing, and that just looks really bad. But what I was going to say is one thing I heard from my great aunt. We got into talking about politics. We don't get along very well. And she said, it's really sad that the news has been brainwashing you like that, or your college brainwashed you to think a certain way. And you used to be so much different. You used to be so much better and honest. And I was like, I don't even know where to start with that, you know?
Yeah. That is really sad when like a personal connection, where the assumption is that you can't possibly have any integrity and your personal connection can't kind of overcome that. That is absolutely tragic. Most people have never met a journalist. Only 79% of US adults say they've never spoken to a local journalist. And that number goes down the less white, old, rich, and educated you are. So many people have no frame of reference, and it's very easy to like, it's like lumping all lawyers together or something, right? If you don't know any, they might just all be evil. And so the perceptions of journalists are definitely monolithic, and we've seen that trickling down. The national sort of narrative around the media and the enemy of the state, and sort of the people who think that you know, the media is hiding the truth from the rest of the country. That is really prevalent, and it trickles down to like any size news outlet, any size community. I'm hearing from like I did a training with like a room full of Texas newspaper publishers, like really tiny papers. And they said that they had covered their community for like, in some cases, decades, and that their relationship with their community and their neighbors was changing as people started to see the role of their weekly newspaper differently. So this is definitely trickling down. And that's one reason, and it seems huge. And that's one reason why our advice to journalists is not to defend the media. Like, oh, journalists would never do that. Our goal is for newsrooms to separate their own work from that, frankly, to say like, we know it's frustrating to consume the news these days. Here's what you can count on from us. And remember that our scope is this. I'm just trying to help you understand what scientists are recommending for your kids to stay safe at school. I'm not interested in Dr. Fauci. Like, that's not our purpose here. So if you're headed to a local newsroom, I think there's a real opportunity to say, okay, this is what, like, here's a picture of our newsroom. Here's who works here. Here's what we're trying to accomplish. Here's the scope of our coverage. And here's our pledge to you about our integrity and our credibility. And we invite your questions about how we could do better.
I think that also, like, in my experience, a big thing that we can do, or that I've seen that I can do, like, as someone who actually does journalism, is like kind of help people navigate the world of media. Like my old job, my boss was like a big Andy Ngo fan. And yeah, I just saw, and I had to like explain to him, I was like, dude, like, speaking as someone who does this, like, it's not like a legitimate journalist. And like, there's so much wrapped up in like the aesthetic of like news and journalism and professionalism that people, like, you know, if you present it as someone who's like, you know, someone who makes the news, people are really quick to trust that no matter what the content may be. And like, as people who actually do it, we can be like, hey, maybe don't listen to that guy.
Yeah, or balance it out. Recognize that some information is designed to persuade you of something or to entertain you. And our goal is to inform you, and here's what that looks like. Don't say things like, oh, journalists would never do that, because plenty of people who claim to be journalists probably do it. And plenty of times I'm really frustrated by what I see. Or people will say, here's what I think. And I'll be like, oh, tell me where you heard that. Maybe it's time to diversify your news diet, right? And so you're absolutely right, Barrett, that like, helping guide, there's sort of a news literacy element, like helping guide people through what it looks like to be a responsible news consumer is a real opportunity. All right, let's look at some examples of how we at Trusting News think about sort of taking the feedback we take in and turning it into something that's useful to a newsroom. So what we try to do is take assumptions about our work and turn those into opportunities to earn trust or information gaps. So if people yell at you and say, you're just doing the fake news, you're part of the liberal media, like whatever it is, and you picture, I know you can see this in your mind, like all caps, exclamation point, angry tone of voice. You know, maybe it's Leo's great aunt. I don't know if she's the all caps type, but like there's this sort of vitriolic tone. There's this like basic level of misunderstanding about what we do. And because so much of it comes in, especially in comments, because so much of the feedback comes in with that kind of tone, it's really easy to just blow it off. Like, you're only covering this story because of this. You would never cover the real story. So what we do is we try to take that and say, oh, people don't understand how we decide what to cover. They think we're purposely hiding things. What is it we wish they knew about our work? What do we actually want to communicate about that? So here are some examples of taking an assumption and turning it into what we wish people knew, our counter narrative. Journalists have a bias against President Trump because they endorsed or run opinion content in favor of Joe Biden. That bias leads them to only cover negative stories about President Trump. This is a super common one. What we actually wish they knew is opinion content and endorsements are separate from and do not influence the news coverage, and that we don't actually look at stories as negative or positive. We cover what's happening, and that's across the board. Embedded in this assumption is our questions about like wire coverage or Associated Press coverage. And often when we're covering politics and the conversation in the comments devolves into like red state, blue state politics, often what they're actually complaining about is like the Washington Post story that your newsroom runs, or the CNN story that comes in a feed on the station's homepage, or an Associated Press story. And that's not something newsrooms are used to talking about that much. It's like not something they're paying that most journalists, that the politics team are actually paying all that much attention to. And so explaining how that works and why you run that national coverage and that it's not actually reported by people in your newsroom. That's like a basic fact people don't understand. So here's the assumption. Here's what we actually wish people knew about it. Another example. The newspaper's one-sided because it covers stories about legislation and ideas focused on minority groups, homelessness, police accountability. When we cover things that are seen as like progressive ideas, a lot of people see just the coverage of those, not how they're covered even necessarily, but just sort of the volume of coverage as a sign of a bias from the newsroom. And so what we wish they knew, we cover legislation so you know what rules and regulations might be changing, and our community is made up of a diverse group of people. It's important that we document and host conversations around topics relevant to the whole community. It can be a really useful exercise to articulate the counter narrative to each of these points that you see coming in. Here's another one. The newspaper is making money by airing political rallies and speeches, and also from highlighting conflict and making things seem more dramatic than they are. We got this a lot with COVID, and that's seeping into politics as well. You're only covering this because it gets you a lot of clicks. You're sensationalizing it or highlighting the drama and the conflict that must be making you rich. And you know what? Journalists don't often talk about how their work is funded. Here's how we make money from advertising. Actually, during COVID, newsroom budgets took a huge hit because like our advertisers are local businesses that also took a huge hit, right? But there's actually a ton of research about how a lot of people think the local news scene, the local news business is actually in fine shape financially. And there's evidence that they would pay more. They'd be much more likely to contribute money if they actually knew that the local news business was hurting. So there's a lot of reasons that we should talk about how we're funded. So like, we take donations. Here's what that looks like. We take subscriptions. This percentage of our income comes from subscriptions. Here's how ratings influence how we sort of recalibrate advertising rates based on ratings or something. So there's an opportunity to be more transparent about how funding works. And then like a statement about conflict and drama in coverage. As we decide what's newsworthy, we take care to keep events in context. Our goal is not to divide, but to help you understand your community and make decisions about your life. Things that we take for granted about our integrity and our goals and our mission. Let's get right to bias, shall we? The news organization wants Democrats to win because they're part of the liberal media. News decisions are driven by that hidden political agenda. This is basically, I don't know, some days it feels like half of the comments that come into a newsroom are some variety of this. And so what is the counter narrative, and have you articulated it? We leave our political beliefs out of the newsroom. As a team of professionals, we'll hold one another accountable to be fair. That said, we are indeed human, and who we are influences how we see the world. We invite your feedback on how we could do better. So my goal for you guys as you head off into your newsrooms is to figure out how to identify themes in what you're seeing and bring them back to the newsroom in a way that empowers them to correct the record about their work. To identify feedback, misassumptions, or accusations that are worthy of addressing. So, and the next question I would invite you to ask your newsrooms is, what do you wish people knew about your coverage? What are they getting wrong, and what do you wish they knew? Let me pause for a minute. How are we doing? Is this making sense? Thumbs up. I can see some of you. Let me scroll down and see if I have other thumbs up. Okay, nodding. Good. Okay, what I would like for you to do is come up with a system for collecting what you find. Screenshot or copy and paste comments that seem super notable, like somebody influential, something that's getting a lot of traction, or that just seem representative of themes. So sometimes they'll be super detailed, like people really do believe that you are making up this source that they don't even exist. You should correct that. Or all of these people tend to believe that a political agenda is driving your coverage. What are we going to do about that? So you're going to look for themes and just comments that seem interesting. You're going to collect them all somewhere. Honestly, I would probably start with a Google Doc or whatever system the newsroom uses, because you can sort of add to it and put newer stuff at the top. And then over time, you have like a record of what you're hearing. So I would put in the screenshots or copy and paste, but I would also summarize, because journalists won't read the whole thing, and say like, here's what's new. I saw these 5 things that I think are worthy of addressing. And sometimes this might be in general, like political bias in the newsroom. And sometimes it might be specifically in your ongoing coverage of this candidate. How are you explaining how this works? Or why did you choose not to report on the background of this crime victim, but you did report on the background of the suspect? And how is that like emblematic of sort of assumptions about the political bent of the newsroom or something? So sometimes they'll be super specific and sometimes they'll be general. And then in terms of who in the newsroom should get these reports, that'll be up to you to find out. Should you send a link to this Google Doc once a day, once a week, whatever kind of cadence you work out with the newsroom? Is there a Slack channel where they talk about audience feedback, or would they be interested in creating one? I know a lot of the newsrooms we work with do that, where it's like, you know, a once a day post that says, here's what we're seeing on social media and comments about your journalism today. Is there like a weekly email to a list of editors? Is there a staff meeting where it would be appropriate for you to just like take a couple minutes and summarize what you're seeing? So ask them, how would this be most useful and who should I communicate with? So here are the questions that I hope you take a little note of, and I'm going to give you this slide deck too. But questions I hope you take note of to ask your newsroom. What online monitoring is already happening? Where do you see conversations about your work? What should I be tuning into? How can I usefully share what I learn? What do people get wrong about your coverage? And what do you wish people knew about your coverage? And those 2 things are the opposite sides of the assumptions and information gaps, right? The misassumptions are what do people get wrong? The information gaps and opportunities to earn trust are what do you wish people knew? So what I have next is examples of how newsrooms can respond. I know that you will have different roles in your newsrooms in terms of whether they are open to your ideas about how to respond. In my dream world, what you do is say, here's what people want to know, and here's what they're getting wrong about our work, and here are some suggestions for how we could address that. And I am available to you to help brainstorm those, and I'm going to give you some resources for where to find examples of what other newsrooms are doing. But I just want to like open your mind a little bit to the type of things we train newsrooms to do for transparency and engagement strategies that build trust. And the slide deck will have links to these in the notes too. So what we try to do at Trusting News, especially when it relates to comments, is to teach journalists to listen and engage and to defend their work when credibility is called into question publicly. When we think about comments, it's really important to remember that when you reply, when somebody leaves a public comment on your website or on your Facebook page, especially about your work, if we're not there answering it, that person gets the last word. And the public conversation about your work, you are absent. You are ceding the narrative to your critics. And when you respond to a comment, you're not just responding to that commenter, but also to everyone else who's listening, everyone else who's reading, which in some cases is an awful lot of people. So it's really easy to say, that person yelling at me in all caps in the comment isn't even really saying anything. He probably doesn't even want to hear what we have to say. I'm just going to ignore it. And yet, if you ignore him, you're ignoring everyone else who might be influenced by what he has to say as well. And then we help newsrooms find themes in what they hear so that they can have proactive strategies long-term. So if you see something coming in, what we train newsrooms to do is respond right away and defend yourself. And then also say, oh, people think this. How can I be more proactive in the future to explain to them how we actually operate? So here are examples of how newsrooms engage and tell the stories of their work. Colorado Public Radio went through a election SOS class of ours and put together this fantastic page on how they cover the election. And it's like, here's what our mission is. Here's what we're here to do. Here's why we invest in election coverage. How do we cover a whole state? How do we choose what regions to focus on and what issues to focus on? How do we select sources for stories? How do we decide who to talk to? What about anonymous sources? How do we handle those? You guys, people do not understand what that term means. There are actually people who think that when we use the term anonymous sources, that means the newsroom doesn't even know who the source is. Most people have no idea that newsrooms don't use them all that often, most newsrooms, especially local newsrooms, and that there's this whole process in place of like, the reporter knows, the editor knows, it has to reach these benchmarks about how the story couldn't be told well without it, all that stuff. How do we make editorial decisions around candidate coverage and interviews and like how much play to give different things? How do we decide what to write, what to cover? How do we make sure coverage is equal between major parties and what about minor parties? How do we fact check things politicians say? So if you click on each of these links, it takes you to a section. The nice thing about something like this is that then each of these is an anchor tag linking to a specific part of the page. And so if something comes up in a comment or you want to reply to a reader, a listener in an email, you can just reply and say, oh, actually, here's how we work to be fair and equitable in our coverage of different candidates. A lot of times the feedback that comes in on comments can lead to really great, just like FAQ pages. So this is a partner of ours in Fort Collins, and Jennifer Hefty she found herself at the Coloradoan answering a ton of questions about crime stories. Like, how do you decide what crimes to cover? Do you follow them through the court system? When do you run mugshots? What kind of crime rises to the level of coverage? And so she found herself leaving a lot of long comments like this one on the top, and they ended up turning it into a page that says, here's how the Coloradoan reports on crime, so that they could just in one place say, here's our approach. That takes some time to do, but it increases efficiency overall because, like over time, then you just have a link you can share back anytime the same questions come up. This is an example from a newspaper that answered a question about fairness in election coverage. You can see somebody saying, are you interviewing Republican candidates as well? This came under a primary story about a Democratic race that was hotly contested. And if you look down at the fourth comment, the Milton Independent newspaper said, because of our limited resources, we had to focus our attention on the most competitive race, which in this case was the Democratic ticket. Before the general race, we will have robust coverage on both sides of this issue. So this is the kind of thing that journalists would take for granted, that like, we're going to people have a tough decision to make here, so we're going to put our focus there. This decision's kind of made already, and so we're not going to focus as much attention there. But if people don't understand your reason for that, they're not going to give you the benefit of the doubt. They're going to insert their own narrative about why you did that, which is, of course, that you must care more about this race or care more about making the candidates in this race look good or bad. They come up with their own narrative. And so we need to be on the record with our own. This is a newsroom partner of ours in Connecticut, and they got a letter to the editor criticizing the fact that they had ignored a story. They do a ton of military coverage. And so they ran the letter to the editor that was critical of their coverage, but then the editorial page editor left a comment under the letter to the editor that says, we will match our reporting on military and veterans with anyone. It's extensive. We can't cover every event. Here's why the focus of this event was not something that we decided to cover, but we welcome your opinion and thank you for the feedback. Be on the record, correct the record, have a counter narrative. Here's an example. I was talking about AP stories. This is a TV station in Cincinnati that we do a lot of work with. And when they were inviting, their news director did like an AMA style Facebook post where he was saying like, hey, we want to be worthy of your trust. What questions do you have about how we operate? And somebody said, how do you determine your stories to be run? Are they straight off the AP or do you fact check them before you throw them out there? Like super accusatory language, right? Maybe Leo's great aunt would relate to Janet here. So Mike is the news director at the station, and he said, we do not have the ability to fact check stories that come from our news partners. We trust news partners like the AP for national and international stories. I hope that helps explain. Oh boy, does that help explain. Janet says, it explains a lot of why you just throw things out there. You have no real journalists, you follow the sheep. The fact that you don't fact check anything is very scary and redundant. So obviously Mike needed to circle back and say, we fact check local stories. We have an entire team of hardworking real journalists who cover local news, and that's where we focus their attention. So I don't think he can persuade a Janet of anything here. I think Janet really does probably think that everyone who runs an AP story should independently fact check it, which, I mean, can you even imagine the chaos? Like hundreds of people run every one of their stories. And so the goal here is not to persuade Janet. The goal is to say, our viewers don't understand how we select and run AP stories, that we don't independently fact check them, how highly rated AP's credibility is. We've had newsroom partners like write columns about why they run AP stories and how accurate those stories are. But at least Mike is on the record here as saying, as sort of correcting the perception. One thing you can really do is keep an eye out for when people are making assumptions about the ethics and just making outlandish accusations. And sometimes, as we heard yesterday in the misinformation presentation, sometimes you just want to ignore accusations because they are so outlandish and they're not getting that much attention, but sometimes they rise to the level of really needing to be fact checked. This is a TV journalist in Jacksonville who, when beaches were reopening in Florida after the COVID Florida's version of a lockdown, which we never really locked down, I'm in Florida, tons of accusations nationwide, honestly, assuming that like photos of crowded beaches were not really taken at that beach or taken from a different day or shot in a way that made it specifically to make it look much more crowded than it was. And so Vic did like a news literacy piece about different camera angles and like made a Facebook album and explained, here's what this looks like from my phone. Here's what this looks like from the station's camera. Here's what this looks like on my video feed. Here's what it looked like from a drone, and say like, it is up to us to figure out which of these views best reflects what we saw there. But this is indeed the same scene shot different ways. It wasn't like digitally altered or anything. So if you notice that people are making accusations like you manipulated this image, that is very often worthwhile for the newsroom to respond. When it comes to politics, one thing newsrooms that do this a lot get really good at is anticipating what pushback might be. And so this is where we really hope that they can start to be proactive. So we do a lot of work with PolitiFact, and they have started to do things like this. When they ran a poll that reflected positively on Nancy Pelosi, they left the first comment under that link on Facebook. And the first comment said, we go out of our way to seek varying polls, different funding. Here's where you can read about how we decide what to fact check and how we decide what to source. And so they just sort of have that ready and leave it before they even get any questions or pushback. They just leave that as the first comment. They also are really good about incorporating what they hear from their readers into their newsletters and into their products. So the editor of PolitiFact included, during the Republican National Convention, she included a couple of reader questions in her roundup of coverage of the Republicans and said like, here's what readers want to know. Where is your fact checking of Democrats? It's right here. Last week we fact checked them. This week we're fact checking the Republicans. And then you seem to fact check Republicans more than Democrats. Are you biased? And she had a counter narrative. We don't try to make either party or any particular politician look bad or good. We work hard to hold everybody accountable. Here's what you can read about our standards. We do tend to fact check provocative statements that sound wrong. So if some people get fact checked more, that might be why. We go where the facts take us, but we're not perfect and sometimes we miss things. I just think this is like a masterclass in how to correct the record, explain yourself, invite feedback, and not apologize for what you're doing. Defending and apologizing are different. Here's a paywall comment. This is from my local newspaper where I used to work. I think it's really valuable if you see that people really don't understand why you have a paywall and why they can't read everything free. It can be really, really valuable to have a few different versions of a comment like this. You can read 5 stories a month. By hitting your limit, you clearly are showing that you care about your community and staying informed. We couldn't stay in business without the support of subscribers. Here's where you can find the link to subscribe. So be redundant with that message, and it's not going to make everybody pay, but at least might help them understand why you have a paywall. And then one more example, as you think about following stories around the internet and using that CrowdTangle plugin to see who's talking about it. This is the Colorado Public Radio reporter I was working with. He was doing a lot of coverage of public art, and he found that this page, the Colorado Union of Taxpayers, had shared a link to his story, and they said, Colorado taxpayers pay for this junk. Well, because he found the conversation, he was able to weigh in and left a comment and said, I'm the reporter. I appreciate you sharing it. Actually, the airport did not use taxpayer dollars for this public art, but some public art does get public funding. I'm working on a series of stories about public art. I would love to, is there someone from your group I could talk to? So he was able to correct the record and find sources who had a perspective that he had actually been looking for by following the link around the internet. So just watching how people react to both the content and the journalism itself. All right, so I would very much like to keep in touch with you. My partner Lynn and I are both on your Slack, and we can both take questions anytime about like, here's a question I'm seeing, here's a theme I'm seeing, what could I recommend to newsrooms? The newsroom's pushing back, how should I respond? Do you have any examples of how newsrooms have handled this? I'm seeing this kind of feedback. Is that normal or is this different? We are absolutely happy to help you. We will keep in touch with you. We have a resources page on our website that you can get to from the bottom of the homepage, trustingnews.org, that has like handouts. One of them is what transparency elements look like in stories. And so it'll walk you through, like, here's how to put a box with a story, an editor's note with a story. Here's how to add something on air. And we also have on our website like a database of newsroom examples and just a ton of things that I hope will be useful as you picture how to help your newsroom respond to what you're hearing. Okay, so I am going to stop sharing my screen. Hello, I can see everybody again. And I would love to just open it up. It looks like I have one comment here privately that I'm going to just read to myself real quick, but I would welcome questions or thoughts from you guys as well. What's on your mind?
I guess I could share a small story about news credibility that was something I was never really taught about, but it was an important lesson for me. I was running the opinion section in my campus newspaper, and I had a series where I would approach people who were part of marginalized groups and ask them to write an opinion piece on what it's like to be them on campus. And there was one student who identified as non-binary, and I really wanted to share their story. And one thing I failed to mention was that it's pretty standard for if somebody writes a story and it ends up being a bit too long, that some minor trimming is sometimes happens just to make it fit. And so when we ran the story, I trimmed out like a sentence or two that I thought was maybe a little redundant or didn't need to be there. And the person that wrote the story got really upset and claimed that the Advanced Titan was like transphobic or something like that, when that clearly wasn't the case, because we were trying to share their story. And I ended up running into them in the union and talked to them and about our practices. And I said that I should have been upfront, that that's a pretty standard thing that happens, and that kind of thing. So even when it's clear that you're supporting of a person or community, the perception of that can be skewed if they're not aware that trimming is pretty standard. So
yeah, absolutely. The contributing to a news product or even being a source, that's not a normal thing for most people. Like, that's not, people are not just familiar with how that operates. There's this great piece that Audi Cornish of NPR wrote about like how she prepares people to be interviewed. Like, here's how this is going to go. Do you have any questions? I am going to need you to be succinct. We are going to edit, like just making sure that people understand there's a real power dynamic in journalism. And for someone to hand over a story about something that's very personal to them, that's a big deal. And so I think you're absolutely right. I think journalists should do a lot more to guide people through that experience and to make sure, if people don't understand your intentions, they're going to make up their own story and it's not going to be a flattering one. So what seems really normal to you is not, it's not something anybody's ever thought of. And they would think, well, I gave them my story. Why would they take that part out? What are they trying to hide? You know, how are they trying to invalidate me? Yeah. And so I think being clear about that when we can, that's kind of what I mean about like validating the user experience. That goes for sources, not just the public, because it's reasonable for people to not understand. And we all jump to conclusions, right, about how things operate that we don't understand. So I got a question privately that I just want to address. Journalists are not under any obligation to respond to comments. And when comments are racist or homophobic or hateful, like plenty of people do not deserve a response. Those people also probably don't need to be in your comment section. And so a lot of newsrooms we work with, I'm surprised, don't really have a good comment policy. And if you find that and you want to talk more or see examples about comment policies, I'm happy to help there. I want newsrooms to have a comment policy that empowers them to delete comments without feeling the time to consistently delete comments that violate, that spew hate or that include personal attacks, or, however the newsroom wants to phrase it. That should apply on their website and on Facebook, that they just don't tolerate it. I think that journalists, the analogy I usually use when I talk about comments is that journalists treat comment sections as if they're hosting a party in their house, and they stock the bar and turn on the music and put out the food and throw open the door and then leave and just hope everybody's on their best behavior. And then we wonder why people are jerks, right? That they drink too much and start to fight. It's so dumb. And so when you're hosting a party, you're in charge of it. and you introduce people to each other. You take people's coats, you refill drinks, if somebody starts to get belligerent, you redirect them to another conversation where they can be less annoying. Eventually, you brew them a cup of coffee and call them a cab. Because if you let one jerk dominate your party, that's on you. And it's disrespectful to everybody else who's there to enjoy the party and is following the rules. And so journalists both don't pay enough attention, don't delete the offensive comments, don't have a comment policy that empowers them to do that consistently and fairly, and then wonder why it's not going very well. So I am a big fan of comment policies. I'm also a big fan of leaving comments like, we value civility and we know you do too. That's why we have deleted comments that violate our policy, which you can find here. Thank you to those of you who are following the rules. And leave a comment like that once a day if you're doing it a lot. But just remind people that you're there and you're listening. Comments do affect the perceptions of the credibility of the news outlet. There's a lot of research around that. So definitely not everybody deserves a response. Definitely some people just need to be kicked out of that conversation or banned. A lot of people use Facebook, like you can have key flag words that where like a comment won't show up or it has to be moderated if it uses like racist language or something. So if you work somewhere where it seems like they're ripe for more conversation about how to improve comment sections, I would love to talk to you about that.
And I think what Leo brought up about sources too is really important, because that's something that I didn't consider when I first started doing this, is that especially if you're working with like a sensitive topic, like I mostly report on like right-wing extremist stuff. And so I work with a lot of like snitches pretty much. And like they get really freaked out if I don't explain every step of this process fully to them. Like I had a girl once give me this recording that she had a teacher at her school that was a member of a militia in our area saying some pretty awful stuff in class. And I didn't cut out the part with her voice. And so she was like freaking out, like people will recognize my voice, people will know that this is me. And yeah, so like part of fostering trust is also between yourself and the people that the stories are about.
It's a big deal. I've had people journalists ask me things like really personal things, and the decision to share is a big one. And you're making yourself very vulnerable when you trust somebody with your story. And so I do think that's really important. All right, I will stick a link to the slide deck on Slack. I want to end a few minutes early because there's another training in 5 minutes, and I'm going to hop over there and welcome that speaker. And I'm sure I'll see at least some of you guys over there. And then I'll see you on Slack. Thanks so much for the questions and for your time today.